The genesis of what I'm going to talk about today really comes from a number of different sources. One is my own interest in this. I've been reading, studying this for 15, 20 years. The other is popular media is really kind of starting to color our understanding of Russian organized crime, and essentially now they are the boogeyman of all the new movies. You think back, Equalizer, John Wick 2, some of the other ones, Nobody, they're all Russian organized crime actors. And third is kind of a surface understanding of we tend to think maybe attribution wise, it's Russia or it's crime or it's an APT group out of Russia. There's a lot more nuance to it that's really colored in large part by the history of Russian-based organized crime. This is we're gonna see this constant theme of how this builds over really the last 150 years. But before we get into that, I'll just introduce myself formally, Gerard Johansen. I'm on the incident handling team at Red Canary, and I work in readiness around detection and response. Prior to my time at Red Canary, I've been in enterprise and consulting for about 10 years, working detection, response, and intel. And prior to that, spent 10 years in law enforcement as an investigator in cybercrime at the state and federal level. And I'm based out of Rapid City, South Dakota. Any South Dakotans here tonight? No, sorry. If you're up there for Wild West Hacking Fest, drop me a line. We're going to discuss why we're actually talking about this. Why are we going to go into the nuances of Russian-based organized crime? And I say Russian-based organized crime because RBOC, or Russian organized crime, is a global phenomenon. If you are looking at, say, our understanding of the Italian mafia, it has some ties back to Italy, but it is not a global institution that the way we see Russian-based organized crime. And when we start to dig deep, we're going to go into the history and then look at where we are today, Russian-based organized crime, and how that actually informs our understanding of the cyber threat that is related to Russian-based organized crime. I'll kind of summarize some things, give you the bad news, worst news scenario of where we are and where we're going with this. The scale is the big thing. The scale of Russian-based organized crime and cybercrime in particular is staggering. And it is one of the few outside of APT groups that we see this scale in terms of organized criminal activity in cyberspace. There are plenty of other organizations out there, from the cartels to gangs to other organized crime, but nobody compares to how the Russian-based organized crime groups operate, their scope of it and sphere of influence. So it's a huge, huge problem across Europe, even into the United States. It's also very hard to pin down from an attribution standpoint when we're talking cyber. Is this a criminal organization that's doing this? Is it a state-sponsored criminal organization? Or is it what I would say is a state criminal enterprise? And that kind of informs what we may have to start looking at moving forward. The big thing to take away is we're going to look at some of the relationships between Russian-based organized crime, cybercrime, and their proxy for Russian intelligence services. And this is not a casual relationship, as we're going to see. We're going to see some serious integration here. Again, going back to that attribution problem, is how do we determine where this fits? Is it a state-sponsored or is it a criminal enterprise? And right now, we're seeing a lot of support for the war in Ukraine. This really kind of changed the atmosphere in the last year and has really kind of colored some of the aspects to what we're going to be discussing. I'm going to give you a brief history, though, because a lot of what we're seeing today is colored in the last 100+ years. We tend to think of Russian-based organized crime as an issue with the rise of Vladimir Putin, for example. But this issue, how it integrates with the government and culture of Russia, goes well before 1999, and as we're going to discuss. We can really start to trace the elements all the way back to about the 1850s, 1860s, so mid-19th century. This is rapid industrialization across Europe and even in the United States. So rapid industrialization brings a lot of people into a concentrated area. So if you're a fan of movies and you've seen Gangs of New York, or read the book, this is essentially what is being replicated in Russia, where in the United States, we had rapid industrialization in New York City. It brought a lot of people together, and it became basically a breeding ground for criminal activity. But the criminal activity starts to become specialized. So you have people that are specifically good at pickpocketing, others that will just club you over the head and take your wallet. But we're starting to see this specialization. And with the specialization becomes a criminal subculture. And this is where we see the Thieves World. Caveat, I am not a Russian speaker, so I believe it's Vorsky Mir, which is the Thieves World. So it is a loosely affiliated group of individuals that are committing mostly property and violent crime with the intent of getting money. That's basically their modus operandi, to use a technical term. And then you start to see a hierarchy build where money goes up to people to get support and to operate into individual areas. One of the notable people to come out of this era is Joseph Stalin, who was a bank robber. And he actually starts the next phase of this. When he takes power in 1924, one of the aspects to his regime was the wholesale imprisonment in the gulags, the Gulag archipelago, of criminals and other individuals within the society that he deemed deviant or, for whatever politically inconvenient, I think is a good way to put it. This concentration leads to more organization. This is something that happens even today when we start to lock a lot of individuals up. You see gangs form, and those gangs start to become more highly organized because they have nothing better to do than to organize themselves. This leads to the Vory, which is the thieves in law. And what that essentially means is a code of conduct is now built around being a member of Russian organized crime or Russian-based organized crime. And this still carries over till today. The thieves in law is a written code, and it dictates your behavior as a member of the criminal underworld. One of the other more public displays in terms of iconography, if you look up there, is the actual tattoos. This is one of the things you'll see it a lot in the movies where, our antagonist is a Russian gangster, is the tattoos. We see codes of conduct. We see an entire subculture being built here. And this is all based around criminal activity. With this organization, the big takeaway from this is a hierarchy starts to be built about who's in charge, who owns what relationship. There's a rigid hierarchy that is built because that becomes important as we start to see how that adapts later on. Stalin dies in 1953, and Nikita Khrushchev, who is then the premier, releases everybody back out onto the streets. So here's the perfect sauce that's just been created. They have spent literally 20, 30 years building up a subculture with codes of conduct and organization, and now they're back on the streets. Starting in 1960s, carrying over into the 70s and 80s, is widespread shortages of high-end and luxury goods within the Soviet Union. Where you have a black market, you have organized crime. Organized crime comes in, starts running the black market. There's a high level of competition between each of these Vory groups that are fighting this out to the point where they're running street wars. But the other major impact that this has is the Vory start to establish relationships with those that can afford the black market goods, which are the political, military, and intelligence higher ups. These are the people that will make use and can get away with black market goods. So there is this beginning of this period, the intertwining of the Vory and the Soviet political and military and intelligence executive class, if you want to say that. This becomes important later on because this is where we start to see the relationships in the 60s, 70s, and 80s that will carry us over to a current state right here. This is exacerbated in the 1980s, where we start to see a lot more loosening of the restrictions in the Soviet Union. It just increases that, think of it as a bacteria. We're just putting it in a nice, warm, dark spot so it can keep growing and growing and growing. 1991, 92, the Soviet Union collapses and this creates chaos. This is really the defining moment that we start to see the modern Russian-based organized crime and Russian-based cybercrime really start to consolidate power and gain a lot of legitimacy. With those controls, a whole bunch of chaos reigns, and essentially what happens is those that were organized crime figures at the senior leadership level start to take positions within the government and major enterprise. So for example, the Soviet Union, they had nationalized the entire oil production. And then as soon as the Soviet Union collapses, then individuals then take over the oil production. So for example, if you were looking at this and you are a fan of Sopranos, imagine Tony Soprano one day starts to run Mobil. That's essentially what is going on with this chaos. These individuals come in, take control. They're actually called thieves in authority. So there is an additional layer of people with legitimate jobs running multi-billion-dollar organizations. The other thing is, and it was covered yesterday when Drew was talking about this adaptability model, the Russian-based organized crime decides to shed that and become more adaptable. So whereas prior to this, you would have organized crime groups that would be in competition with each other, now they are essentially loosely affiliated with individuals shifting, not really alliances, but working more on a task organization. This individual will go here for 6 months and work on something. This individual will go over here. So there's a much more adaptable and less of this hierarchy and keeping everybody within specific silos. So where are we today? The modern era really starts in about 1999, and Vladimir Putin rises to power. If you're maybe not up on Vladimir Putin, he was one of these individuals that came out of the intelligence community. He was a KGB officer, and he already had connections in the 90s, being a local politician with some of these individuals. And what you see is the emergence of a conditional understanding that Russia now had a nationalized underworld. What does that mean? And the reason I read that off is that is one of the key aspects here. In the 1990s, to contrast that, where the United States was in terms of organized crime, we do not have the nationalized power of organized crime or cartel groups in the United States the way that Russia, post-Soviet, has, where essentially the Vory, those that are part of this world, bankers, economists, government officials, PhDs, and yes, cyber individuals, people that are highly skilled in computer crime. So this is where the Russian business network, if you're familiar with that, in about 2006, 2007, really starts to become part of this operating model. And the major challenge that we have is cyber criminal groups operate with impunity, and they have those informal and even formal connections that allows them to actually carry out their operation without really any fear of prosecution. Another quick side note, for example, the Russian government and the United States government do not have an extradition treaty. So these individuals, we're going to look at some specifics, are really under no fear of being extradited to the United States for crimes that they commit here, such as the Colonial Pipeline or any of the other ransomware attacks. In criminology, there's a concept called harm capacity. And when we're looking at organized crime or other organized entities like cartels and gangs, we look at their harm capacity. And what that essentially means is, how much can they actually do? How much impact can they have on the culture? How much impact can they have on individuals within the society? So a real quick breakdown. What we're dealing with right now are highly sophisticated at basically every level. Whereas you might see in a cartel, there are some highly sophisticated individuals at the very top. But as you start to work your way down, they become less and less able to actually carry out criminal activity on a sophisticated level. They're basically brutes. They're muscle. Whereas Russian-based organized crime has this sophistication level really all the way up and down. This also ties directly into their cyber capability. They're very, as probably we are all aware, they're highly sophisticated in terms of their cyber. There is in fact, an air of legitimacy. And this often comes from the chaos of the 1990s. Is a lot of individuals had to leave their government jobs because there was no money to pay them. So they see that working for a Russian-based organized crime element is actually a legitimate job, and that will pay them. Technically proficient. Computer science, MBAs, PhDs. Again, the level of sophistication is staggering compared to other organized crime groups that have appeared and disappeared in the last 100 years. Those deep political connections essentially makes them immune from any type of consequence for what they're doing and the operations that they're conducting. And there is a lot of cooperation with the intelligence community and Russian-based organized crime, which really puts them so far ahead of any other organization. Imagine, for example, Tony Soprano and his North Jersey crew meeting with the CIA, director of the CIA, or senior leadership at the CIA or the NSA. That is essentially what Russian-based organized crime has right now. So cyber, how does this all fit in? This is a really good quote. I'll actually show some of the sources that I use for this. It actually comes out of one of these, but it is essentially going back to that technical sophistication and capability. Is you had a lot of out of work or low prospects for work, some very talented, very intelligent individuals. And this is a way to make a lot of money very quickly with very little risk of actually going to jail. So for example, REvil Corp, this is probably one of the most egregious, like out there. There is no doubt their connection to the Russian intelligence services, specifically the FSB. Anybody familiar with Maxim? Booties? Okay, Yakubets. Just a quick history on REvil Corp. Do some reading. Looks like the Dridex moving into Raspberry Robin. This is one of those things that we see also talking about Drew and their ability to shift and move around tools, techniques, kind of keep ahead of things. Again, this is probably the most egregious example I've seen of this type of cooperation. The real crime is the paint job on the Lamborghini, but we have Maxim here on the left with his paint job, we'll put it that way. In the middle is his wife, who he married. Her father is Edward. Now, Edward is a TV personality, a former FSB executive. He was an officer in the FSB, and he actually runs a paramilitary or private military contracting firm called Vempel. And this is literally the most egregious that I can see in terms of the direct connection. There's images of Edward at the wedding, hanging out, just you would normally go to a wedding, and his daughter is marrying the head of one of the largest ransomware groups out there. Conti is another one. Now defunct, referencing Drew's talk yesterday in terms of splitting into the Royal Ransomware. This is a well-funded and connected group, but again, there was another discussion about the Conti leaks. Shows the potential for FSB funding. There was actually requests for breached data. So here is kind of where we look at this from a perspective of attribution. Is a ransomware group actually hits something, a target, and It may not have been at the direction of the FSB, but now we're looking at there is an existing relationship. So they can actually work through that, see what they have, and maybe call up their buddy at the FSB who they know through a criminal network, criminal underground, and essentially offer up that information. So there's a much more deeper level of cooperation as a two-way street, as opposed to what we see here, where to get criminals to give up any information, we'd have to squeeze them with prison time or whatnot. There is this two-way street. We also see Conti, and we are seeing hacktivist groups and cyber criminals actually taking part in cyber operations and support of the war in Ukraine. Again, this is all kind of the same stew versus these cyber criminals are allowed to operate. No, they are essentially maybe even advanced towards taking some sort of geopolitical stance as part of their relationship with the intel community and their status as criminals within Russia today. Dark side. Anybody see the REvil roundup? The video of the cops pushing in the door. This was a high-profile arrest right before everything was going down in Ukraine. The FSB decided to do a roundup and included a dark side member in that. The missing piece is what actually happened to these individuals. So this might signal, I'm going to hazard a guess, might signal some sort of in the front door of the police station, out the back. This is also that portability and that Drew talked about yesterday, is take one down, all of the criminal elements scatter, they go work for other groups, all with the understanding that this is all part of the game when we're talking Russian-based organized crime. I talked about the Glim picture. The very, very little sliver of hope is, I believe the name of the company was Chain Analysis, was actually able to pull back some of the funds from the Colonial Pipeline attack. So there is some, a little glimmer of hope in this group in particular, because organized crime operates for the sake of gathering money. That's it. That's all they do. That's what they're there for, is they're consolidating that skill and sophistication to grab some cash. If you can interfere or trace that follow the money routine, that actually can help a great deal. So we'll round it up here. If we look back 150 years in terms of the relationship with the Russian government, this is a feature, it's not a bug. This is the way that their government operates in terms of a relationship between organized crime, cyber organized crime, the intel services, and the political leadership. What this does for us is there's a significant overlap that we're seeing here. We talked about intel services and cyber criminals. Evil Corp is probably the most egregious. I'm sure Maxim can pick up the phone at any time and get the FSB on the phone. The FSB can return the favor. This makes attribution very difficult. This is really one of the reasons to maybe look at this as a more nuanced and more, or I should say less clear cut than criminal APT group. Again, that kind of state criminal enterprise. They are highly flexible and don't maintain a rigid affiliation and hierarchy the way that we would traditionally think of organized crime. And this was covered extensively by Drew yesterday with those graphs showing, hey, this is how they move in and out of this space and actually are able to disband and reconstitute themselves somewhere else. And most likely developing that from an existing model of what Russian-based organized crime was doing in the 1990s up until today. As I said, we have no extradition treaties, so there is very little to do in terms of cooperation. And we've also seen that cooperation diminish a lot with the current state of the world. But I will leave you this. From an assessment standpoint, Russian-based organized crime and their cybercrime affiliates I submit they inhabit a gray area. They're part state and part criminal. And at that point, you know, all bets are off, and maybe we have to think about this from a different perspective. I've included some resources in the slide deck in terms of books, articles, everything like that. You know, if you want to reference anything and really want to study a little bit more, that's right there. So thank you very much.